Yeah, I am looking forward. There is something wrong in the line, in Tony's line. The voice is broken, and the sentences are broken.
I can hear that.
Yeah.
Tony, are you at home or are you in a hotel quarantine?
No, I'm in my office in Sydney.
So therefore, you should have a good Wi-Fi. So it's you are breaking up. We can't hear you clearly.
Well, maybe it's the connection. I'm not on Wi-Fi. I'm actually on a wire system, so it should be good.
There's nothing. I'm asking my technician here. There's nothing going on at our end. No. So Tony, may I suggest that you log out and you start your computer again and log in again? It could be a simple thing like that. Otherwise, we're hearing you really. We're hearing you like every second word is broken.
Yeah. Likewise. Okay.
Yeah, that will be okay. I'm sure when he comes back, it'll be fine. If he's in his office, therefore, there's no issues with Wi-Fi. Jeepers, we're starting with some technical issues. That's not a good way to start. Apologies, everyone. Can't be helped. So, Ehud, we were talking about this pandemic. So imagine you are the doctor in South Africa and you found this little variant and you tell the world, look, guys, I've found a new variant and it's actually not really killing anyone. Well, not as yet. And suddenly everyone shuts down their borders to South Africa. I mean, what is the incentive for them to tell us for the next variant? Please tell me.
Well, number one, the interest that they have is to make sure that if there is a variant which is endangering the life of people, then they want to take the necessary measures in order to prevent it, to block it, and to have the assistance of the international community in finding the proper response for such a threat. So by not sharing this information, you're not doing any good for yourself. You are only worsening the possible treatment of this by the medical community, both in your country and in the world. And I don't see any good reason for it.
So you totally don't accept that the response of governments has been overreaching and disproportionate, and you don't think that that's the case?
Sure, there is, of course. There were many countries, including my government, in the last couple of years that was hysteric and panicking, and there were many restrictions which are unnecessary. But for instance, the insistence on vaccination was absolutely positive and should have been enforced, sometimes even with legal measures. I think that the closure proved not to be necessarily effective. I myself was against it from the beginning. The total closure, which kept people in their homes, and I'm sure that this is true about other.
So down the bottom there.
So political leadership is not always very smart, but this is not new.
Hello.
Not everyone is Tony Abbott.
You are
G'day.
back, Tony.
How are you? It's still pretty crackly, I'm afraid.
Yes, it's better than before, though. There is an improvement. If that's all we can do, that's all we can do, Tony. So let's rock and roll. First of all, since last year, in Israel, you had another election, and like the other twice before, Bibi Netanyahu didn't get elected. You've got now a new prime minister, Naftali Bennett, and I believe he's a good friend of yours, Ehud.
I wouldn't say that he's a good friend of mine. I mean, he's a different generation, and I'm not a supporter of his point of view or his general political orientation. But I did everything I could in order to help create the necessary political environment for him to become prime minister, and for him to succeed. I told him that someone told me a year ago that the day will come that I will wake up every morning and pray that Naftali Bennett will be successful as the prime minister of Israel. I would think that he's crazy. But this is the reality. I pray for his success. This is a very, very unusual government. I don't think that there was any such government in a democratic society in the last 40, 50 years, any place that we know, neither in Europe or in North America or in Australia, a government which is made up of a majority of 1 out of 120 members, of members of parties which are entirely divided on some of the most fundamental issues of our lives, from the extreme right to the extreme left. And they all have put aside all the differences, and I mean, this is the weakness of this government, that they don't deal with some of these issues, and they focus on what they can do together. And they have restored normalcy into our lives, which is the most important thing. You know, if someone asks, I was in America now for a few days, and, you know, there are those who think that Joe Biden is not doing so well and so on, and so, some criticize him. I like him. I know him. I met with him many, many times. I think that he's a good guy, and he's a good man, and he's a good political leader. But the most important thing that everyone recognizes is that Biden restored normalcy into American life, which was missing in the last 4 years. And the same is true about Israel.
So would you say that the exit from Afghanistan was normalcy for America?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, number one, I will remind you that the first decision about pulling out from Afghanistan was of Trump. Trump was the one that decided to pull out from Afghanistan. He, like many things that he said he didn't do, that's another thing. And he also started the pulling out, or continued the pulling out from the Middle East, Trump. So this is a national consensus. And the truth is that I must say, look, question is how the Americans accomplish their pull out, but which is another issue. But why does America have to have 10 or 7,000 soldiers in Afghanistan? What can they do that they can't do from the outside? I know, I can't go into details, obviously, but I know what are the technological measures that they have. They can get an accurate picture of everything that goes on in Afghanistan, in every corner of Afghanistan, at every second of the day, in the morning and at midnight. And they can then decide how they want to react to it. Why do they have to have thousands of soldiers over there? I don't know. And certainly I don't know if Afghanistanis don't want to fight themselves. And the army doesn't want to fight, and the government doesn't want to fight. Why the Americans have to shed their blood in Afghanistan for something which really is not a major threat to the stability of the world and of American interests?
Tony, welcome back again. And hopefully you can hear me.
Mate, I'm really sorry. Yeah, I can hear you now for the first time properly.
Okay, good. Well, that's an improvement. I was asking Ehud what he thought about the Biden withdrawal from Afghanistan. And I won't do justice to the answer of Ehud, but he basically says that America didn't have any business to be there, and that there's nothing that they can do from the outside that they couldn't do from the inside, that they couldn't do from the outside. My apology for the paraphrase, Ehud.
Yeah, that's all right.
So what is your viewpoint, Tony?
Well, I would certainly concede more insights into these sorts of issues to Ehud than I would have myself. But it seems to me that if you are going to make a difference in very difficult places like Afghanistan, you've got to be prepared to stay for the long haul. And I think that was always the difficulty with Western intervention. The relatively liberal, relatively pro-Western government could only survive while it had a bit of Western muscle there to back it up. And as soon as the Western muscle left, the government collapsed because it was dependent upon forces that were always going to get with the strength. And without the West, the strength was Taliban. So I think that was the fundamental problem. And I think it's bedeviled all of the recent Western American-led interventions in the Middle East. They have tried to build sustainable democracy in societies where there is no history of liberal democracy without being prepared to stay for long enough to make it work. Why was the peace preserved in Western Europe for so long? Because Allied armies stayed in Germany for 50 years. Why has post-war Japan been so successful, at least in part? Because American forces are still there, ditto South Korea, but nothing like the same stickability was ever evident in Afghanistan. And so we have the result we've got.
Yes. And interestingly enough, Ehud, you were mentioning about Donald Trump, and recently there was an interview with an Israeli journalist and Donald Trump, where he actually used the F words towards Bibi Netanyahu, and he also said that Bibi was never interested about peace with the Palestinians. I'm sure you heard that interview, and I'd like very much to hear your thoughts on this.
The only thing which I subscribe in terms of the accuracy in what our former President Trump said was that Bibi never wanted to make peace, except that I don't remember Trump sharing this observation with the international community and with the Israeli public opinion at the time they took place. Then they played each one of them or the two of them together to try and pretend that they are doing something, while Trump says that he knew and he felt and he understood that Bibi doesn't want to make peace. Look, the problem is this. You know my opinion about Netanyahu. I don't like, I don't trust, I don't believe in his integrity and in his desire to do anything other than what suits his personal interest. And I said it in almost unlimited opportunities in Israel. But the interview of Trump is an expression of a person which for him everything is personal. There is nothing there which is not personal. Everything is judged by his personal interest, his personal reaction, his personal sensitivity. The fact that Bibi congratulated Biden. By the way, Bibi was much late in congratulating Biden after his victory in the election. He was waiting and waiting and waiting until it became embarrassing that the state of Israel, the friendliest of all nations to America that its leadership didn't congratulate Biden. Trump says that the fact that Bibi congratulated Biden is a betrayal, as if the relations between Israel and America rests entirely on the personal desires of Donald Trump. This is absolutely crazy. I think he's a pathetic person. I don't want to go into all the details. I refer you, and I'm sure that Tony will have read it already, or if not, I recommend to you read the new book of Bob Woodward, Pearl, in which he writes about the last few months of Trump and the beginning of Biden and the changeover and the events of the 6th of January and so on and so forth. Unbelievable, unbelievable. There is nothing that you have to add to this. Just read it and understand what an unbelievable a change took place in the life of our world as a result of the elections in America.
But in all fairness, Ehud, you owe to Trump the recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. First nation on earth that did that, and the first president was Donald Trump. You owe him the recognition of the annexation of the Golan Heights. You owe him the Abraham Accords. You owe him the cancellation of the Iranians Accord with the previous administration. I mean, you cannot
Take the
say.
last one.
But can we agree that that Trump was not pathetic at all when it comes to his policies vis-a-vis Israel? I mean, with Trump, I think that you have to distinguish between the rhetoric and the policies. I mean, it's a question of don't listen to what he says, but look at what he's doing. Don't you agree?
No, entirely. On the opposite. And the last example that you brought is precisely the evidence of how damaging he was to the state of Israel. The cancellation of the agreement on the Iran nuclear was the main catalyst for the dramatic improvement in the Iranian nuclear program in the last 3 years. Until 2019, since the agreement was signed by Obama, there was not 1 millimeter of progress in the Iranian nuclear program. And the somewhat arrogant exposition of Israeli operation in Iran, the archives, proved precisely this. It proved that in 2003, the Iranians considered having a nuclear program, a military nuclear program, and that they stopped it in 2004, 2005. And since then, there was not any major progress in this, except between the two, 2018 till now, as a result of the fact that America pulled out from the agreement. So this is one example. It is universally accepted. There is not one person in Israel, I can guarantee you, not one expert, military expert, security expert, nuclear expert, any expert that has to deal with it, that doesn't share this observation that the pulling out from the agreement by America was a dramatic mistake, which caused an unlimited damage to the national interests of the state of Israel. And this was part of the policy of provocation, of arrogance that was typical to Trump and to Bibi Netanyahu. Tell me, what did he do against Iran?
But wasn't that with the support?
Iran? What did he do against North Korea?
But wasn't that those policies? Sorry to cut through, Ehud, but the policies that Trump implemented was in accordance to the Israeli government. He didn't do it.
The Israeli government was as lousy as him. That's why we wanted the government of Israel to be replaced. What can I say to you? Listen, we live in an open society. I can't, when I talk in an international panel such as this distinguished one, with you sitting and the former Prime Minister of Australia, which happens to be a personal friend of mine, but also a man that I have enormous respect for his leadership and his achievements. I can't say things which I didn't say continuously for the last few years, and which were said by so many others in the public debate in Israel. The reason why in 4 consecutive elections in 2 years, Netanyahu failed to achieve a majority is because people got sick and tired of a politics which was focused entirely on the personal interest of the prime minister rather than on the national interest of the state. And this was the reaction of people. And that's why he is at home now and not in the position of prime minister.
So, Tony, do you have any comments on what Ehud has said so far?
Well, I would join you, Albert, in taking a more nuanced view of former President Trump. Yes, many people have accused him of being a narcissist and not being a doctor. I wouldn't try to make a clinical diagnosis. But when it comes to Israel, he was absolutely as good as his word. He recognized Jerusalem as the capital and moved the embassy, which was something that all of his predecessors promised, but none of his predecessors had delivered on. So big tick for Donald Trump for actually honoring an important commitment to the American people and to the wider world. And look, the peace deals that Israel recently made with many of the Gulf states, which make Israel's overall security so much better, do owe a lot to Trump's Middle Eastern diplomacy. And of course, everyone said that if he recognized Jerusalem as the capital and moved the embassy, the Arab Street would erupt, there'd be a conflagration. No. A firm, strong, decisive move actually improved Israel's position. So whatever faults Donald Trump may have had as a human being, and whatever mistakes he made in the aftermath of the election, I reckon that at least where Israel is concerned, he was a pretty damn good president.
And you know, I only regret that you were not the Prime Minister of Australia at that time, because I'm pretty sure you would have recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel as well.
Well, that's dirty water under the bridge in terms of Australian politics, Albert. And look, the other thing that Donald Trump did, which I haven't touched on yet, I dare say you and Ehud have been touching on this earlier, he recognized the nature and the intention of the Iranian regime. And so he pulled out of the weak deal, which had earlier been done. And again, I think that was a tough but necessary step because obviously Iran has always been set on nuclear weapons, and it has in no way renounced its oft-stated intention to obliterate Israel. Now, you cannot allow a rogue state possession of nuclear weapons if there is any possibility of stopping it.
And Ehud,
I'd like to say a couple of things.
Sure, absolutely.
I'm not number one. People tend to ignore the fact that while Trump, for which I congratulated him for recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of the state of Israel, he, at the same time, on the same formal decision, he said that the borders of Jerusalem will be determined in peace negotiations. In other words, don't get it wrong. Donald Trump recognized West Jerusalem as the capital of the state of Israel, which is long overdue, by the way, and this is indeed something that most Americans didn't do. It didn't have any practical impact on anything, but this was something that was overdue, and it was nice, and it was good, and certainly had deserved to be credited for this. That's number one. All the rest, his politics, like on almost many other things, was more rhetoric and much less action. And as for the agreement with Iran, Tony, I'm telling you, as someone that was fighting against Iran at the time that I was prime minister, in many different ways that obviously can't be elaborated. I can say this. When I first joined the cabinet, when I returned to the national cabinet in 2003, there was a select group of ministers with the then Prime Minister Sharon, myself and 3 others, that was briefed almost weekly by all the top experts of Israel about Iran. And at that time, the common wisdom was, which was presented to us, that in the year 2008, it's most likely that the Iranians will have a nuclear weapon. And by 2009, they are absolutely, definitely, 100% will have a nuclear weapon. We are now in 2021. They still don't have it. And they don't have it not because of statements and not because of the rhetoric of presidents or prime ministers, but because of things which were accomplished in a subtle, daring, sometimes unbelievable ways by those who made it for themselves a challenge, a life challenge to prevent Iran from having a nuclear weapons. The departure from the agreement in 2018 is considered by everyone in Israel, and I insist, everyone, not just political rivals of Bibi Netanyahu, as a dramatic mistake which provided the Iranians with an opportunity to move forward with the nuclear programs. And again, the agreement that Obama signed was not ideal. There were many weaknesses in this agreement, but it was considered to be an improvement in comparison to what had existed before the agreement. And now what we are trying to do, everyone, we, the Americans, everyone are trying to repair the damages that the departure from the agreement caused. So let's not forget it. But we may have different opinions about Trump, which I obviously respect. I belong to those who are not said so much that he spends most of his time now in Mar-a-Lago, in Palm Beach, in Florida.
Which is a lovely part of the world, by the way.
Beautiful.
So Ehud, keep the ball. I want to ask you a question about another former Prime Minister of Israel, that's Ehud Barak. Very recently, like a week and a half ago, he sent a shiver down the spine of all Israelis when he said that Israel didn't have the means to fight Iran and that they should side with the Americans in trying to make a deal, which comes back to what you just said. But that, to me, contrasted very much with Dadi Barnea, the new chief of Mossad, that said just a few days prior to this declaration of Ehud Barak that under his watch, he will never allow the Iranians to get to the nuclear bomb. Now, for anybody doubting what he said, I referred an article to Tony Abbott no later than this morning that was published in the Jewish Chronicle, which is, as you know, where the Mossad puts its information when they want to publish something because they don't want to.
Now you tell me something that I didn't know. I didn't know that the official spokesman of the Mossad in Israel is the Australian Jewish Chronicle.
I beg your pardon?
I didn't know that the Australian Jewish Chronicle is formally the spokesperson.
No, not the Australian, the London Jewish Chronicle. The London Jewish Chronicle.
I don't know that they even know that they are the spokesperson.
Well, they're not the spokesperson, but it is too much of a coincidence that anytime something happens that happens with the Israeli Secret Service, it then gets published sometimes, not always, of course. But in this instance, I think they were sending a message because they detailed in that article all of what Mossad has been doing in the last 5 years. As far as Mr. Barnea is concerned, it's an illustration about what he said, I feel. But then you've got Mr. Barak that comes in the scene and say exactly the opposite, which is all good because it's all confusing. If you are an Iranian listening to the rhetoric in Israel, you get to know what democracy is and what an open society does. That is, it's total confusion and you can't tell what is what. So that's a great thing. But for those poor Israelis, they've been really scared by Mr. Barak, and I want to know if you can reassure them, or can you confirm what Ehud Barak said?
Let me surprise you. I think that both Barak and Barnea were accurate. And what they said was not contradictory at all. Barak said that he doesn't think that we have, as of now, we have to build it up, we have to prepare it, but we don't have the capacity for a comprehensive military attack on Iran that will destroy all the different sites where they are building up in separate places, sometimes at a great distance from one to the other, their atomic capacity. So he was correct. What Barnea said was also correct. He said he can promise. Whether he had to say it or not is questionable. And it was questionable on the minute that he said it, and there was the reaction in Israel. But that's a different question. I don't want to go into this now. I know Danny Barnea, the head of Mossad, he used to report to me. And he's a brilliant guy and a very good man. And he said that in his time, he will make sure that Iran will not have a nuclear capacity. But he didn't say that Israel has an option of a comprehensive military attack. He said he meant precisely what we meant and we did for the last 15 years, which is that there are other ways, instead of a comprehensive military attack on Iran, that can damage their preparations and can prevent their capacity and can destroy their experiments. And this is something which has been done. I don't want to go further into many other details. I can only say to you that the community of nuclear scientists in Iran has been reduced dramatically in the last 15 years, and not all of them lost their lives in a natural way. So this has been published many times. So there were different ways that the international community, not just Israel, by the way, dealt with the threat of Iran. What Barak said is that we don't have presently a capacity for comprehensive military attack. And I think that he shares with Taliban the same conviction that Israel will not allow Iran to have nuclear bomb. And we will not allow Iran to have nuclear bomb. That I can promise you.
Well, I think that will reassure the Israelis. We are lucky in Australia, Tony. We don't have that kind of threats, but we now
you never
apparently.
know. With Iran, you never know.
Well, let me tell you, I was just about to finish my sentence. We've got a much bigger one, and that's China. What on earth is going on with China, Tony?
I think China is on the march in a way that it certainly hasn't been until the era of Xi Jinping. And maybe it was all planned all along, and Deng Xiaoping's hide and bide strategy was something that they were always following. And now they've dropped the pretense and are flexing their muscles. But there is absolutely no doubt, based on the Chinese leadership's own statements, that they are bent on East Asian and then world domination. And they think they will be the global hegemon by the centenary of the communist takeover, that's to say in 2049. Now, this has massive ramifications for all the countries of the world, but particularly for the countries of our region. They've crushed Hong Kong. They're bullying all their neighbours. They are increasingly belligerent towards Taiwan. And I stress, when I say they, I mean the Beijing government. I don't necessarily mean the Chinese people. And I think if I were a Taiwanese leader, I would be standing to my own defence, because at any time the Chinese could start an assault. I think the Taiwanese think that if there was no chance of help from others, they would be potentially subject to attack at very short notice indeed. And as we know, were Taiwan to fall, that would have extraordinary ramifications, the least of which would be complete disruption of global trade and an arms race in East Asia, the likes of which the world has never seen. And that would be the least bad outcome for the Chinese takeover of Taiwan. If there is conflict over Taiwan, it will be very difficult for Australia to stand aside, as Peter Dutton, our Defence Minister, has recognised. And obviously, if we are involved, there are all sorts of potential ramifications, and we can't assume that the Australian mainland would be untouched by it.
You were recently in Taiwan, Tony. How is their morale over there?
I was very impressed by the Taiwanese leader that I met. President Tsai is a really, really capable person. She's moderate and subtle in her approach. Their Foreign Minister Wu, likewise, is an extremely impressive individual. The other senior leaders I met there were all highly capable, and there was nothing gung-ho or over the top about them. I don't think there's any chance that the Taiwanese will do anything rash, but I do believe that they are standing to their defences. They are improving their military capability to defend against a sea and airborne invasion, and the more losses that could be inflicted on any invader, the less likely an invasion is. But let's not underestimate the absolute determination of the current Beijing leadership to take Taiwan and to take it as soon as they can, if they think they can do it without an impossibly high cost.
So Australia announced last week that it won't send a diplomatic delegation to the Beijing Games. Is that an adequate answer? That's following the American lead, of course.
And good on members of the Australian Parliament, such as Erica Betts, who've been calling for this for quite some time. And let's give credit to the Biden administration for taking the lead, and to the Morrison government for being a fast follower. I think it's the least we can do, but it is something. It is significant. It will cost the Beijing leadership face. I think that does matter.
Did you know what's going on in our region, Ehud?
Well, I'm of course not as familiar as Tony, and I didn't have a chance to learn all these different aspects from a close distance as you guys are, particularly considering the fact that China is a very, very active, and one can say even aggressive, not militarily aggressive, but economically aggressive, and in trying to send to expand the sphere of influence in the countries near them. And I'm fully aware of the fear of and the opposition of the United States and Australia and other countries to the trade policy of China, which is interpreted by many countries not just as a trade for itself, but as a trade which is part of a more national policy of expansion and of expanding the influence in many parts of the world. I very much hope that the threats and the warnings that President Biden sent to China, by the way, as well as to Russia in a different direction, will be helpful, and that they will not cross a line which may not be left without an answer that can lead to an unnecessary confrontation, and that the status quo will remain. I can only say that while we are engaged in our difficulties and problems and challenges in our part of the world, we sometimes are reminded that we are not the only corner of the world where there are difficulties and problems. There are other corners, not less important, not less vital for the stability of the world. And I hope that, I think that the leadership of Australia, and I think that the leadership of America in those areas is responsible, and I appreciate it.
Yes. So you mentioned Russia, and we know also what's going on at the moment in the Ukraine's border. There is a military build-up. Of course, the Russians say it's only a military exercise. The European Union and NATO are seeing it very differently. It must be hard in Israel to juggle between the loyalty to the United States and being a strong ally of the United States, and at the same time being a close friend to China, that Israel is, there's no question about it, and also having a dependent relationship really with Putin, because he is in charge of the airways in Syria. So if you want to do anything north of Syria or to the north east of Syria, you need to pass by Putin. So how does the Israeli government juggle all of this? Many balls in the air.
Yeah, there are many balls in the air. I don't think that everything that we need to do in Syria has to go through some kind of approval, or at least tacit approval by the Russians, I ordered the destruction of an atomic reactor in Syria. I never asked the Russians. I never told the Russians. I just did it. And no much rhetoric, but a lot of effective action. And I think that today we don't ask the Russians. We just refrain from hitting areas which are inhabited or manned by Russian soldiers for obvious reasons. We don't want to get, we don't have a war with Russia, and we don't need to fight with Russia. We want to impact the Iranian penetration into Syria, and we are doing it. We should have, this was a dramatic failure of the government of Netanyahu, that we didn't prevent the penetration of the Iranians with military force into Syria in the first place during the civil war, which we could have done, at least as much as we are doing now, bombing them and attacking them from the air. We could have done it then and may have avoided all of these difficulties. But look, we have problems and these are not new. None of these problems is a threat to the very existence of the state of Israel. And this is a major, major difference from what the situation was 50 years ago when we were much younger. Then there was a genuine threat to the life of the country. Today, Israel is an enormous power, an enormous military power, and enormous economic power. And the Israeli economy is the most stable economy there is. And the Israeli currency is the most stable currency there is. The dollar is going down, the pound is going down, the euro is going down, the shekel is going up all the time for years and years now. And we have enough resources to defend ourselves. And if worse comes to worse and we'll have to fight, we know how to fight, and we did it in the past, and we'll do it. But I don't think that we have to wake up every morning and make a declaration about it. I think that we have to examine ourselves very carefully and to sort out the proper way and to find every possible avenue of communication with the superpowers. The first and foremost, the most important partners of Israel are the Americans. America is the basis for the strengths and the stability and the confidence of Israel's now and in the future. We want to maintain good relations with China. We have very broad economic relations and commercial relations with China. They are very much, they are curious a lot at the Israeli technologies, and they invest a lot in the Israeli economy. We have good relations with Putin. I must say that I personally had quite a few long chats with him when I was prime minister. And one thing which he always reminded me, by the way, was, I'm the president of Russia. He says, I will not allow to put Israel into any jeopardy, he said. And he said he distanced himself completely from the policy of the communist parties before him. He said, the communists were anti-Israelis, I'm not. I'm not anti-Israeli. I have nothing against Israel. Most of my best friends live in Israel. My teacher at first grade lived in Israel, and actually he bought her an apartment in Tel Aviv. And I will not allow anyone to jeopardize the security of Israel. But I'm the president of Russia, and I will not give up any of my interests as Russian in any corner in any part of the world, including in the Middle East. And to be honest with you, much as I didn't like some of his friends, you know, what could I say? I just told him, listen, you make sure that that I will not have to act against some of your friends in a way that will make them bleed.
So I think that I would like to invite now Alan Howe to open for our members that are here with us to question from the floor. So Alan, are you there?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me, Albert?
I can hear you. I cannot see you. A problem with your camera?
Oh, no, that's a benefit to everybody else. Don't worry about that. For some reason, it won't work.
Okay.
I wonder, a couple of questions have come in, particularly about the deal with the nuclear deal with Iran. Now, we know that we can't trust China, just ask the Hong Kongers. But does not a nuclear deal with Iran ask us to trust the Ayatollahs?
That's a question for Ehud, yes?
No, let's ask Tony Abbott that question.
Tony Abbott, go ahead.
Well, essentially, I agree with the premise of the question that any effective deal with Iran requires you to trust them, and I don't think you can. So yeah, I think the questioner is correct, but Ehud may have a much more sophisticated response.
No, Tony, I'll tell you what. Based on what we know, which can't be disputed, in the period between 2015, when the first nuclear agreement between President Obama and few other countries, including some of the best friends of Israel, like Great Britain, like Germany, of Angela Merkel, like France, of Macron, like others, all of them, from 2015 to 2018, the Iranians kept the agreement without any deviation whatsoever. Why? Because there was checks and balances. Had they violated the agreement, they would have lost all the economic benefits that they entertained as a result of this agreement. The economic benefits were that they had no sanctions, or that the sanctions were lifted, partly, not at all, but partly, which helped them a great deal. They know that if they will violate the agreement, and it is something that will be examined day in, day out, then there will be a complete economic boycott on Iran. They will be cut out entirely from the banking system of the international community. Their boats will not be able to sail freely to all kinds of international harbors, and so on and so forth. And that will cause a terrible damage to Iran, which already has created a lot of unrest inside Iran. So the question is not whether these are decent people that are peace-loving people that want to make peace and that they are prepared to make peace. They are killers. They are bad people. But they care for Iran, and they know what may be the price that Iran will pay if they will not observe the commitments made in this agreement.
Just sticking on that deal, can I ask you, Ehud, you mentioned before that there were obvious flaws in Obama's original deal. What were the most outstanding flaws?
In my mind, the fact that it was limited to 15 years,
yep.
After which there was not a commitment that they will then not be able to build atomic capacity, nuclear capacity. I think that was, and I think that the concessions, the economic concessions in the agreement were more generous than I would have given. And I think that this is something that now has to be carefully examined.
Yesterday, Ehud, Robert Malley, the special envoy for Iran, referred to the possibility of a mutual return to compliance Do you see that as possible?
Who, Rob Malley said so?
Yes.
Let's see. I don't know. It's hard for me to say. I'm not familiar with all the details of, the informal contacts which are now taking place in Vienna. But if Rob Malley thinks that it is not impossible, let's hope.
And sorry to cut in, but this less for less idea, less compliance for less, threats. I mean, less sanctions. What is that about, in your view, when you've got an envoy that's defending such a weak idea? If he says that it's going well, I mean, it's going well in what way?
The question of mutual compliance, the question of mutual compliance can be interpreted in two different directions. So the question is, what does it mean? I don't know.
Okay, Alan, keep on going.
Okay, Tony, Hugh White's column in The Australian 2 weeks ago was quite controversial and certainly very hard-hitting. And he referred to the possibility of China calling America's bluff over Taiwan. That might not be how a lot of people, including yourself, see it. But if America goes to war, are we, as seems to have been committed to, are we, committed to going to, inevitably committed to complete involvement as well? And is that just the price of the US underwriting our security?
I'm very much with Peter Dutton on this, Alan. I think that if there were a major conflict in our region involving the United States and we weren't involved, I think the ANZUS Treaty would almost inevitably thereafter become a dead letter. You cannot expect countries to help others if those others won't help them at need. And ANZUS is based on us helping the Americans and the Americans helping us. I can't see America's need for help being greater than it would be if they were involved in a very serious showdown with China across the Straits of Taiwan. Now, I know the Americans are not formally committed to defend Taiwan in the same way that they are formally committed to the defense of Japan, but I did note the statement of Deputy Prime Minister Taro Aso a few months ago that the Japanese would regard an attack on Taiwan as existential. That certainly very strongly indicates that the Japanese would help to defend Taiwan. And if the Japanese were involved in helping to defend Taiwan, it's hard to see that there wouldn't be, one way or another, a triggering of the United States obligations to Japan and for a triggering of our obligations to the United States.
So, Tony, was Australia taking part in the conflict in Afghanistan to defeat the Taliban and create some freedoms for the people of Afghanistan, or were we there to preserve the ANZUS Treaty for another day?
I think it was a bit of both, Alan. We were paying our dues on the alliance, and we were also trying to build a much better Afghanistan. I think we were pretty successful in paying our dues to the alliance, but because it was never really part of the overall Western strategy to be there for the long haul, sadly, we've got Afghanistan back where it was with the Taliban government. Now, we can hope that 20 years of relative freedom might have changed the nature of Afghanistan in ways that make the Taliban less toxic. But the early reports out of Afghanistan are not at all promising. It looks like a very bad situation indeed, and that can't be good for anyone.
On that issue, can I ask you, Ehud, can the Taliban's behaviour there were lots of boots on the ground and 41 Australian lives lost as well. But can the Taliban's behaviour be moderated by the US forces offshore?
You mean you refer to what I say, that there is nothing that America can do from the outside that needs to force them to stay inside?
Yes.
The answer is they can't change the nature of government. But even if they will have 100,000 soldiers in Afghanistan or more, they wouldn't be able to make the Afghanistani government a democratic Western government. Okay? So the question is, what are the priorities and what are we prepared to pay so that a country which doesn't want it will pretend to have a regime that really will not function. So this is not something that can be done and will not be done. And I think that we had to relieve ourselves of some of the dreams that of what we can do, you know, at a distance of thousands of kilometers from our sovereign territories in order to change other countries. But if you talk about terror, if you talk about all kinds of military activities, illegal military activities, I think that the ability of America is not limited to the specific place where it happens. They can be outside of Afghanistan and they can see everything and they can hear everything and they can identify every place and every event and every person that they want. And they can take the necessary measures in order to prevent things which they believe are in contradiction to the fundamental human rights that are acceptable by our values. So the answer is, I think that the Taliban are quite aware of this. The fact that they were very, very restrained when they took over, not to cross a certain line against the Americans when they were pulling out, and so on, was a realization of what can be the force of the response, which can be exercised by the United States.
Tony, on that, you spoke earlier about the fact that peace was maintained in Europe after World War II because tens of thousands of American soldiers were stationed there. What would Europe have done without Elvis Presley, I ask? But with the that's true. But nonetheless, isn't the difference between Europe in 1946 and Afghanistan in 2021 that Afghanistanis, even those trusted into our Defence Force precincts, when I say ours, the United States and Australia and Great Britain, that they were killing us?
Look, that's a very fair point. Very fair point indeed, Alan. The so-called, I think, blue on blue killings, I think very, very disconcerting for the Australian public and for the American public. Look, Afghanistan was and is a riven society, almost a feudal society. It certainly doesn't have the degree of, I guess, civic sophistication that the countries of Europe had. Nevertheless, if you look at history, you can see that Britain maintained a degree of sway over Egypt, over much of the Middle East, Iraq, for instance, from the 1920s through to the 1950s. Even Afghanistan was stable enough under the monarchy prior to the late 1970s. So it is possible to do things even in countries such as Afghanistan, but you don't do them well by going in, smashing the place up, expecting it to change overnight, and then pulling out and thinking that you have achieved transformation. And as I said, I stand by my earlier comments, Alan. Notwithstanding the great difference between Afghanistan and Western Europe and Japan, I do think that more could have been done that would have depended upon a much more enduring presence than the United States and its allies were prepared for. And look, on that note, I am going to have to vanish in a second, but technical difficulties notwithstanding, it has been a wonderful discussion. Thank you, Albert and Ehud. Lovely to see you. And as I said, next year in Jerusalem.
Well, normally you wouldn't get away without a drink at the bar of the King David. So next year, indeed, we will do that. But before I let go, Ehud, I just want to ask you, Ehud, one last question about a prognostic, really, with Bennett now, Naftali Bennett as the Prime Minister. What are the prognostics, in your view, for any peace with the Palestinians under his mandate?
I don't think that that this is something on the agenda of the present government. And the interesting thing is that there is no any demand in Israel for the time being to do something about it, because everyone understands that while Bennett is not prepared to make any gesture that can open up a dialogue between us and the Palestinians on a reasonable basis that can lead to an agreement. On the other hand, there is not much that he can do that will be an outright provocation to Meretz and to the fundamentalist Arab party, which is part of the coalition. So this is out of the agenda at the present time. Regrettably, this is one of the reasons why I say that I will not vote for Bennett, and I didn't vote for him because I entirely disagree with his attitude towards the Palestinians. But Israel has few other critical issues, and he is capable of responding to some of these issues in a way that is much more appropriate than what the previous government did. And that's why I hope that his government will continue at least for another year or another 2 years, so that Lapid will change over with him and will continue this government. And then there will be elections, and I think there will be a new division of political powers in Israel.
Very good. So Ehud and Tony, it was an absolute honor to open the dialogue 2021 with you. And I really mean it when I say, let's hope that there's no more pandemic soon, and we will be in Jerusalem together next year.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, my friend.
Thank you. And thank you for inviting me and providing me the opportunity to share thoughts with
Thanks, mate.
A distinguished leader in Australia.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Ehud.
Thank you.
I'll see you guys in 15 minutes.